Hello, it's good to be with you again for our Adult Sunday School lesson, and we are back in the book of Joshua. We have about 2 more weeks in the book. Next week, we're actually going to be jumping very far ahead in the narrative and looking at the last 2 chapters over the next 2 weeks. A tiny little sliver of Joshua on Easter Sunday 2 weeks from now, and mostly Joshua 23 next week. And that will kind of put us beyond many of the passages that form the center of the book, that deal a lot with the land and its allotments to the various tribes. It's not because those portions are not important. They certainly are. I hate to say it, that they probably are a little bit boring to us when we read them, but they shouldn't be. Alas, we're not going to have the time that we need to really mine from those passages what could be of more than just interest to us, and of course, great theological importance. But we'll do what we can as we allude to those. Probably next week. All right. So anyway, we actually have quite a few big passages to read, or I should say a couple big passages, but quite a few verses that span chapters 7 and 8. So we're going to read them, pray, and then we'll jump right on. All right. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 7, we'll only read through verse 5 and then skip down to verse 20, which if you see right where those 3 dots are on the screen is where we make the leap to verse 20. The Israelites, however, were unfaithful regarding the things set apart for destruction, or haram, the ban, those things that are devoted to the Lord, and he does with them as he chooses, whether it's setting them up for destruction or to be assimilated in some way, but completely devoted unto him and in no way, shape, or form allowed to be touched or misused, unappropriated by other people. When I say touched, obviously they're going to have to be physically handled, but I mean for their own purposes. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, took some of what was set apart, and the Lord's anger burned against the Israelites. Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Bethaven, east of Bethel, and told them, "Go up and scout the land." So the men went up and scouted Ai. After returning to Joshua, they reported to him, "Don't send all the people, but send about 2,000 or 3,000 men to attack Ai. Since the people of Ai are so few, don't wear out all of our people there." So about 3,000 men went up there, but they fled from the men of Ai. The men of Ai struck down about 36 of them and chased them from outside the city gate to the quarries, striking them down on the descent. As a result, the people lost heart. Now to verse 20. Achan replied to Joshua, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I did. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful cloak from Babylon, 5 pounds of silver and a bar of gold weighing 1 pound and a quarter, I coveted them and I took them. You can see for yourself. They are concealed in the ground inside my tent with the silver under the cloak." So Joshua sent messengers who ran to the tent, and there was the cloak concealed in his tent with the silver underneath. Forgive me. They took the things from inside the tent, brought them to Joshua and all the Israelites, and spread them out in the Lord's presence. Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the cloak, and the bar of gold, his sons and daughters, his ox, donkey, and sheep, his tent, and all that he had, and brought them up to the valley of Achor. Joshua said, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? Today the Lord will bring you trouble." So all Israel stoned them to death. They burned their bodies, threw stones on them, and raised over him a large pile of rocks that remains still today. Then the Lord turned from his burning anger. Therefore that place is called the Valley of Achor still today. Then to Joshua 8, verses 1 through 2, and then right there where our 3 dots are, we'll go to verse 14. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all the troops with you and go attack Ai. Look, I have handed over to you the king of Ai, his people, city, and land. Treat Ai and its king as you did Jericho and its king, except that you may plunder its spoil and livestock for yourselves. So this time, none of these things are devoted to the Lord. They are not considered haram or part of the ban. Set an ambush behind the city." Now to verse 14. When the king of Ai saw the Israelites, the men of the city hurried and went out early in the morning, so that he and all his people could engage Israel in battle at a suitable place facing the Arabah. But he did not know that there was an ambush waiting for him behind the city. Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten back by them and fled toward the wilderness. Then all the troops of Ai were summoned to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. Not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel, leaving the city exposed while they pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, hold out the javelin in your hand toward Ai, for I will hand the city over to you. So Joshua held out his javelin toward it, and when he held out his hand, the men in ambush rose quickly from their position. They ran, entered the city, captured it, and immediately set it on fire. The men of Ai turned and looked back, and smoke from the city was rising to the sky. They could not escape in any direction, and the troops who had fled into the wilderness now became the pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city and that smoke was rising from it, they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. And then now just one verse from Joshua 11. And of course, the context that intervenes between chapters 8 and 11 will go on to speak about the conquests that will ensue after Ai, the deception of the Gibeonites and the treaty that is made. And then after that, Gibeon apparently being something of a treasured city, not a treasure city necessarily, but a treasured city in the eyes of many of the other client kings. And when I say client kings, I mean, historically speaking, there was still quite a bit of influence that Egypt wielded over the land of Canaan at this time. That's a separate discussion, but just trying to be historically accurate as far as we can understand history at this point in time. These client kings that ruled over these cities, these nation states that were part of the tribal holdings of the Canaanites in the land of Canaan, namely led by the king of Jerusalem, Adonizedek. And hearing what had happened when Gibeon, which apparently was more of a prize to capture than Jericho was, as goes just the veracity of the city itself. But nonetheless, Adonizedek creates a coalition of kings to try to combine their forces to go against this Israelite threat. We talked about that a little bit last week. And then the southern conquest begins. After that is done, the northern conquest will ensue, which pretty much lends itself toward the capture of Hatzor as one of the most prime cities in the area. And then after that, they all coalesce back at Shiloh. And there at Shiloh in Joshua 18, they will erect the tabernacle. So the Ark of the Covenant has not been housed in the tabernacle up until this point in time. It's just been carried around on the ark or on the shoulders of the priests. And that would explain the reason why, in the context of the passage we just read, that Joshua is able to fall down in front of the ark, because presumably it's not inside the tent of meeting, as it will not make an appearance again until Joshua 18 in Shiloh. Will be the first time since they crossed the Jordan that they've set it up, because the battle campaigns are largely over with at that point. Nonetheless, Joshua 11:23, so Joshua took the entire land in keeping with all that the Lord had told Moses. Joshua then gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And after this, the land had rest from war. Of course, there are going to need to be other skirmishes that are going to come about, which basically begins the book of Judges for us when we have those mentioned, as goes when they actually start. Now, they will be mentioned in the book of Joshua, because Joshua is going to continue to reiterate to the people that this isn't over with yet. The major ordeal is done, but of course, there is a list of unconquered people groups given in the book of Joshua, and the Lord's rationale for why he does not drive those people groups out in the time that Joshua is leading the land. But that's a discussion for another time. So let's come together and pray, and then after that, we will begin studying this a little deeper. Lord Jesus, we are grateful, as we always are, that you give us time and you have created space, whether in person with each other or even in these virtual forums, not just at Kingsville, but so many that we get to share with other people, brothers and sisters across the world. Thankfully, because of the internet and the ability to be able to connect with each other in these kinds of ways. We're grateful, Lord, that you give us the chance. Even though we might not be able to physically interact with each other, yet we can engage with you in your word. And we pray that we would do that here and now. That as we read and mine from the stories of Joshua, we will see them in a different light and with a deeper sense of awe than what many of us have grown to reverence from this book. And that was the faithfulness of your promise in handing over the enemies of Israel in the holy war that you declared on the descendants of Cain, the inhabitants of this land that you promised to your servant Abraham, and of course to his posterity after him, of which Joshua and all these people can lay claim to that. that there is much more theologically here for us to understand and appreciate that we need to wrap our minds around. But of course, only you can divulge these mysteries and secrets to us. And so we ask that you would do that, not simply for the sake of helping us learn more, but that we may be challenged in our faith and our understanding of how this story, as others that have come before it and others that will come after it, are repeated and patterned again in the New Testament, and that your story in the gospel mimics this in many, many ways, which brings with it implications for us and how we are to behave and act, conduct ourselves as we live out these kingdom promises. We ask this in your name, for your glory's sake. Amen. So going back to verse 1, let's just appreciate here what I'm calling trouble in the garden. And I put again, because you may have noticed some weeks ago, I used that title before. And every time I use the phrase garden here, it's not a phrase, I suppose, word, what I mean is, of course, reminding you that Canaan is supposed to be a new provincial Eden space, that is the thrust of this experiment that God has started with Abram, who becomes Abraham as part of God's covenant promise with him, to signify that he is going to be the father of many nations, and the promise that God has given to him is ultimately going to be bequeathed to the generations that come from him. And that promise is to, in some enigmatic way, as it's spoken to Abram, he is going to bless all the nations of the earth, and he will become a father to these nations. So he will be granted a multi-ethnic family as time marches on, and this promise continues to be revealed and, of course, lived out by those who get the chance to participate in influencing the nations around Canaan with the Eden blessings that God intends to bring to them through the conduit of this nation, this people that God has crafted from a sonless man, that being Abram. And of course, by the end of his story arc, he now has many sons, but with that, one particular son who is going to carry this legacy forward, correct? And so now they are in this provincial Eden space. Abram had a chance to enjoy that, and so did Isaac as it was passed to him. But by the time both Abram and Isaac were dead, the only parcel of ground that was owned and that was being passed on then to Jacob, who now becomes the head of the family, is just the patch of land that has the cave where Abram and or Abraham at that point and Sarah are buried, and of course Isaac and Rebekah, and someday Jacob will be himself. And then by the time the people leave the land to go to Egypt, that's really all they still own until this time when they have crossed over the Jordan centuries later and now are being gifted the land by the Lord. And so if this is a provincial Eden space, then it carries with it some connection to the garden. And we have outlined those parallels ad nauseum at several points in weeks past. But I don't think I perhaps could have been any more literal in my use of this phrase than in this particular story, because notice how in this little tiny snippet of a genealogical rendering telling us who exactly this Achan is, going all the way back to the son of Jacob, that being Judah. If we take those names and we translate them roughly, because of course what we need to understand, and this is just a very short trip down a rabbit hole, but every Hebrew word for the most part works on a 3-letter root. And from that, many other words can be derived once you start inserting vowels in there. And many of those words are going to sound somewhat similar to each other. They may be translated differently for us in English. And today's story, ironically, is actually a very good example of that, given the wordplay between Achan and the name of the place where he is executed and then buried, and that being the Valley of Achor, which was not Achor prior to that point, but it becomes so after that moment. And Achor is supposed to be translated trouble, as much as Achan is also supposed to be translated trouble, which we'll get to here in just a second. But working backwards through this, I think if you stop and appreciate what's being said here with respect to the names, Yehuda or Judah being given as the patriarch from which this lineage comes from, we have the word praise, because that was what his mother Leah spoke about his birth and the reason why she chose to name him Yehuda. And then the son that comes from him, the twins that were born through Tamar, one particular, that being Zerah or Zerah, His name means dawn or sunrise. So if you think about it, considering the idea that I have chosen this phrase to title this portion with, trouble in the garden, and all that I just said with respect to Abraham. Sometimes I want to say Abram, but I forget I need to stop saying that. I need to say Abraham. Nevertheless, Abraham's story, and it's recapitulating the garden narrative in the Genesis 1-3 prologue. And that is the reason why God is gifting this land to him, which would carry us to the next name, Zabdi, which is to give, pass on a gift. And all three of those words, we can in some way directly allude to, or I should say indirectly allude back to the garden narrative in and of itself, with respect to the idea that, of course, with everything that's going on there, seen through the filter or lens of the words the Lord speaks to Job, and he asks him the question toward the end of that book, where were you in the beginning when the sons of God began to sing the first of choruses that were leading to the eruption of praise unto God in the universe when God began to create. And of course, sunrise, one of the first creative acts the Lord does is to distinguish day from night, light from dark, as he calls light out from the darkness. Of course, the gifting of a gift, one could say, is perhaps very easily attached to the gifting of the garden to the man that he had made outside the garden, planted in it. But I think this hits home all the more when you get to Carmi's name, and his name literally means vineyard. So here we have kind of a small little retelling of the story of the Garden of Eden in and of itself through these events. That's what we are supposed to appreciate here. I think the person who wrote the book of Joshua is gifting us to those names giving us. I'm sorry, I keep stumbling over my words. Hopefully my brain will get right here in a minute. Are giving us these names, not simply for the sake of just helping us appreciate who Achan comes from, because really it doesn't matter who Achan comes from. He is not destined for greatness in any way that we can tell, for anything that was ever said about him in the story before, because nothing has ever been said about him in the story before. This is where he gets introduced to us. And so, of course, there could be other motivating reasons for why his genealogical reckoning is given to us. But I think this is one of the things that we are supposed to see, is that these names all point back to this story, because there are many other points of parallel that will come about in this story and the Genesis prologue itself, which we will discuss. So having said that, then I think we're appreciating something of a textual linkage between those stories. And then, of course, the Genesis prologue is capped off with Genesis 3, which sees trouble brewing in the garden, a virtue of the tempter, the shining one who enters into that sacred space and then begins to try to lure the image bearers away from God and following their own passions and taking wisdom for themselves that is forbidden to them. So, verse 2, Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and told them, go up and scout out the land. And you'll notice eventually in the way that this story is told in chapter 8, once they go up against Ai in full force, that Bethel also gets wrapped up in this. So presumably the instructions given to these men would be to go and scope out the areas of both Bethel and Ai. And if you look at them on a map, they are very close together. So it probably wouldn't have been that difficult. Nonetheless, we don't actually know what they scouted out, because we are not told that in the text. Now, there's no fault that we can really find here with respect to what Joshua is doing. This is exactly what he did back in chapter 2. But we should also appreciate, before we just link this back to chapter 2, where do we see these kinds of actions popping up to begin with? Remember, Moses' prayer in Numbers 27 was that the Lord would not leave Israel like sheep scattered without a shepherd, that the Lord would raise up a man who would lead them in going out before them and in bringing them back in, give them a shepherd as Moses had been. And the Lord answers that in the context of Numbers by telling Moses explicitly that he is to consecrate and anoint Joshua to be his replacement. But then when Moses is speaking his final words to Israel in Deuteronomy 18, he tells them, the Lord will raise up a prophet for you like me. He will put his words in his mouth. You will listen to him. And certainly that converges on Jesus. But immediately it converges on Joshua in a limited way, because its total fulfillment will not be seen until we get to Jesus. But having said that, there are countless points of parallel between both Moses and Joshua with respect to the things that they do and say that show that Joshua was to fulfill that type that is being given there with respect to that prophecy. This is one of those things, as Numbers 13 tells us about Moses first sending spies into the land because the Lord had told him to scout out the land of Canaan that he's going to give to the Israelites, a leader from all of the ancestral tribes, and eventually they'll come back 40 days later with a full report. Joshua does the same thing, but with only 2 spies in the opening of the book of Joshua, when he sends these 2 men to go out and spy out Jericho and surrounding property. But from what we gather, they only looked at Jericho. So with that, there's nothing wrong with what Joshua did in sending spies. Sometimes I think Joshua, in some ways, gets roped in to the problem of what happens as this defeat and debacle at Ai ensues. And there may be some things that perhaps could be laid at his feet, but I think sometimes it might be a little bit more of a hard press to make those things stick rather than the actions of the spies who come back and report what they do. Let's jump right on into that with respect to verse 3. And after returning to Joshua, they reported to him, "Don't send all the people, but send about 2,000 or 3,000 men, because the people of Ai are so few. Don't wear out all the people there." Now, of course, you're not going to find anything being phrased the exact same way in Numbers 13 once that group of 12 spies return from Canaan and they meet back up with Moses in the camp and they give their report, which goes on to say, "We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey. And here is some of its fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong. The cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev." But contextually, what they are saying is remarkably similar, because both groups, the Numbers 13, 12 leaders, one from every tribe coming back, do verify, indeed, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. Look, appreciate some of the fruit. These spies, however many Joshua sent to go spy out Ai and Bethel, come back and they verify that, yes, the people, not necessarily like it was with Jericho, as goes their teeth chattering, their knees knocking, they are terrified and panic-stricken, and it seems like the city is ripe for the taking. But rather they assess the fact that they perhaps are more of a nominal threat, and it won't require the use of all the force. By that, I certainly don't mean what you encounter with respect to the Star Wars stories. I mean the actual force of men that are clad for war. But right? Silly. I could just think of my son saying something like that whenever if I was talking to the story about the story to him. But anyway, they say don't send all the people because of the fact it seems like we can easily take them. So as opposed to the way that the report is pitched in Numbers 13, which comes with a negative connotation at the end of it, like, well, yes, it is an abundant land, but the people living there, they're strong, their cities are huge and fortified. The people themselves are very large, and we, of course, look like grasshoppers in their sight. They assess this threat to be small, and there's no reason here to require the full use of all the armed force to go and to take it, because this should be easy enough to do if you just use 2,000 or 3,000 men. Now, when we get to the end of the account that gives us the destruction of both Ai and Bethel, there's about 12,000 people who are involved in that. So how they thought they were going to be able to take on the force of both of those cities with only 2,000 to 3,000, which would leave them outnumbered, kind of escapes me. But that aside, it seems like in their mind, this is sound wisdom as much as it does in the minds of these 12 men in Numbers 13 who are saying, we can't do this. That's sound wisdom to them, because there are guaranteed casualties that will come from the war effort itself. And it's possible it will be the outright annihilation of the people. And with that, offering up wives and children to these people, because most of the men will have been killed, and those that are left as part of the conflagration will be no doubt enslaved. However, in Joshua 2, when we get the spies who come back from Jericho after they hid in the wilderness for 3 days, they went to Joshua, son of Nun, and reported everything that had happened to them. And they told Joshua, the Lord has handed over the entire land to us. Everyone who lives in the land is also panicking because of us. Had these men went into the area of Ai and Bethel and scouted it out, coming back, seeking to speak not only the truth of the matter, but perhaps even invoking the Lord as to what do we report to Joshua as goes, what he would have us say and what we saw there, because it doesn't seem like perhaps they penetrated the city the way that the Jericho spies did. We certainly have absolutely no tale of them holding up in a tavern setting or anything like that, where they are trying to gather some intelligence, which is the reason why they wound up meeting Rahab in Joshua 2, as opposed to what we have here in Joshua 7. Maybe they didn't even go into the city itself. Maybe they just kind of sat outside and watched the perimeter and outskirts of the city and the comings and goings of the people, maybe the rotations of guards at various points during the day, and what have you. And then just based off the size of the city, made the assessment they did that, again, people are few there, will be able to conquer with relative ease. So they give this report to Joshua. And I suppose if we're going to accuse Joshua of anything, maybe it's the fact that he took this report on face value and accepted the perceived what it was, and the idea of not wearing out the force. But having said that, in and of itself seems a little silly, considering the fact that the force of men were not exhausted after the Jericho battle. I mean, after all, the Lord brought the walls down. All they had to do was go run over the piles of rubble, and everybody on the inside were fair game, free game to them. And they were able to easily put everybody to the sword, as goes the city of Ai. I'm not sure if they were thinking that perhaps they might have to use a different battle plan or tactic, which very well could have been the case had the Lord instructed them using a different battle tactic. And in the end, he does, because the fight itself does not ensue inside the city. Rather, it's the fight that ensues outside the city once the men come out to meet them in battle, again, following the same path or pattern that had been used before when the Israelite forces, minimal as they were, came knocking on their door and attempted to try to attack and overcome them. And so a different battle plan and tactic was used, because that is exactly what had to happen in order to deceive those people into thinking that, hey, they're going to try this again. It should be just as easy as before. Had they consulted the Lord on what to do and given the Lord the chance to give the battle plan to them as he did with Joshua, march around the city one time each day for 6 days, 7 on the seventh day, blow the trumpets, and then the walls will come down. Had they give the Lord the chance to interdict what exactly he wanted, then perhaps the battle strategy would have been entirely different. Joshua started off on the right foot, but the people who he used and employed in this, which very well could have been the same spies that he did in Jericho, for whatever reason, came back with a different report, or a report of a different type with different wisdom involved. But Joshua seemingly does not follow up by asking the Lord what it is that he would have them do, as goes limiting the size of the force, because he's received no instruction from the Lord on that. Then the defeat of Ai ensues, and in verses 6 through 7, Joshua tore his clothes, fell face down before the ark of the Lord until evening, and put dust on their head, or he and all the elders of Israel, they put dust on their heads, and they say, "O Lord, why did you ever bring these people across the Jordan to hand us over to the Amorites for our destruction? If only, why did you, and if only, we have been content to remain on the other side of the Jordan," which sounds a little different in some ways, but eerily similar to what we have in Numbers 14. Now, remember, I think from what we've seen so far, these stories are textually linked with respect to the precedent that's been set before, not only in Joshua 2, but earlier than that, back in Numbers 13, with the first round of sending spies, of which Joshua was one, and has candid memory of that, into the land to spy it out. Moving on with that narrative after the end of chapter 13, and the fact that the Lord wants to wipe them out, the whole community then goes to Moses and they say, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt, like remaining on the eastern side of the Jordan, staying there and appreciating the inheritance that some of the tribes have received so far, rather than coming here to experience this devastating defeat? Now, you might wonder, why in the world is Joshua taking it so hard? I mean, this isn't the first city that they've come to, and the losses themselves are rather minimal. I mean, only 36 soldiers out of the tens of thousands that are armed under his command. Not to say that any life to him is less than precious, but it's the fact that, one could presume there very well may be casualties in some of these conflicts. We have no recorded casualties with Jericho. Joshua may have begun to presume that as long as they do what the Lord requires of them, they may not experience the loss of a single casualty. And having even 36 men, of which he no doubt knows very well, die is hard for any battle commander to have to deal with, or at least a compassionate battle commander. But nonetheless, it's the fact that in ancient Near Eastern warfare, that when a king, and Joshua is no king, but he is the leader of this nation in an almost king-like fashion, as much as Moses was. And in the Psalms, Moses is called a king over Israel. But nonetheless, that when a king winds up assuming control over the kingdom that has been bequeathed to him by his father, it's different than when a challenger to the king, who is usually a military commander, a general of sorts. Egypt's history is fraught with this sort of thing, who winds up deposing the king and usually executing them, and perhaps even putting all the members of their household to death, so there are no rival claimants to the throne. That when they do that, they are tried and true and tested as goes being battle commanders. But when we're talking about a crown prince born in the house of the king, who was raised under his father, groomed to become king, it's one thing to learn how to wear princely robes, crowns, eat at banquets, enjoy the fine and nice things. It's totally different, on the other hand, to learn how to become an actual combatant commander. And it's expected that those kings would lead their soldiers into battle and not simply trust everything to the generals themselves to execute and do. I mean, we see that kind of thing with Sennacherib, the emperor of Assyria at the time when Hezekiah is king over Judah, and that Sennacherib, while he does send out Rabshakeh, Tartan, and so forth as his emissaries to go and address Hezekiah, yet Sennacherib is actually wrapping up a battle in the nearby city of Lachish. And so with that, he's only sent these men ahead of him in order to try to mitigate terms of surrender, because Jerusalem is the last city in Judah to be conquered and captured. And of course, Hezekiah is there waiting for Sennacherib to come knocking on his door and lead his forces. And it was widely said that it would usually be better for a king who is new not only to the throne but to the battlefield, when the time comes to go out to battle, to pick a skirmish that he can win, because with that he will gain and earn the respect of his men and their trust when he is leading them into battle against a perhaps more formidable force that is going to be more challenging to them, which is definitely not the time to start testing the battle planning and strategies of this new king, correct? So Joshua has experienced victory already, but this kind of defeat and blow that comes to him afterwards could be some of the reason why he is acting as he is when he is coming before the Lord. And notice how he is sounding a lot like the Israelites did in Numbers 14, when they are groaning before the Lord in this very whiny way. If only, why did the Lord? And Joshua uses almost the exact same phrases. However, while that may be seen to his detriment, this perhaps to his credit, that in the follow-up verses, he goes on to say, "But what can I say, Lord, now that Israel has turned its back and run from its enemies? When the Canaanites and all who live in the land hear about this, they will surround us, wipe out your name, our name from the earth. Then what will you do about your great name?" When the Lord speaks and he tells Moses, after these people register their complaint, that he wants to wipe them out, Moses intercedes yet again, as he does in the context of Exodus 33 and 4, after the golden calf incident. He says the Egyptians will hear about it. Like he said, these peoples will hear about what has happened here. They will surround us, wipe out our name from the face of the earth. Moses used the exact same thought process with the Lord. The Egyptians will hear about it. For by your strength you brought up this people, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of the land that they have heard about you, Lord, or they have heard about you, how you are among your people, and they have seen you face to face, how your cloud stands over them, and how you go out before them in a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. And if you kill this people with a single blow, the nations that have heard of your fame will declare, since the Lord wasn't able to bring his people into the land he swore to give them, he has slaughtered them in the wilderness. And so all of this, of course, attaching to the Lord's name, the Lord's reputation, as goes the ploy that Moses uses in both Exodus and Numbers to intercede on the part of the people who have grievously grieved the Lord with respect to their blasphemies and their rebellion. And Joshua is also posturing himself as an intercessor here. However, what is unbeknownst to him, while it is to Moses, because he witnesses the actions of the people and knows the Lord is justified in the response that he gives on both of those occasions, Joshua has yet to understand what exactly is the reason for this terrible setback and the loss that they have experienced, which leads the Lord then not only to appreciate what Joshua has done, but then to respond as he does. He says to him, "Stand up. Why have you fallen face down? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant that I appointed for them." Now, I would like to isolate the use of the phrase here, "stand up," because at many points in the narrative before this, going back to places like Leviticus 26, when Moses is actually giving first blessings for the nation of Israel if they actually obey the covenant and are faithful in this relationship with the Lord, paired with the terrible, calamitous, destructive curses that will come if they choose not to, in which he warns them that they will stumble over one another. And this, of course, are the Israelites, as if fleeing from a sword, though no one is pursuing them, and you will not be able to stand against your enemies. Joshua is not standing. His posture here at this point is that he has completely fallen prostrate, face down before the Lord. The Lord is telling him to stand up, but as this goes on, he says to them that they will not be able to stand. Joshua, as their leader, will not be able to stand until the situation has been rectified, as goes the violation of the covenant, the things that have been taken. And of course, this also pairs quite nicely with what is first told to Joshua in Joshua 1:5. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. However, in the second contest of battle, people have stood against them and they have proven victorious. Now, I want to draw attention here to a couple of things. One, with respect to the use of the term violated. I just call to mind once again, this is how we somehow get shortchanged, I think, a little bit in reading the Bible in an English translation. No doubt we have to, because most of us, perhaps exclusively all of us, are not bilingual. And if we are, we certainly are not well versed in reading or understanding Hebrew. But it's important for us to be able to learn how to incorporate lexical tactics in studying the scriptures so that we can appreciate certain subtleties like this. And what I mean is he says they have violated, which is from the Hebrew word abaru, as you see here. However, as you heard me say earlier, all Hebrew words are made from a three-letter root. In some cases, not common, but in some cases, it can even be a two-letter root. And in this case, it's the B and the R, as we see it represented in English, that actually form the backbone of this other word that is used in another context, which is a little different in the way that it's actually rendered here in English. But before I get to that, let me actually wrap up what's going on here in Exodus 19. So keep this in mind, and I'm going to go back to that here in just a second. But he says, they have violated my covenant. Now, what does he mean by covenant? The Lord did not make a separate covenant with them and telling them, do not touch the things that have been devoted to destruction. Those are simply the Lord's words that he has commanded them. What we are to understand by that is what is alluded to back in Exodus 19, when he has drawn them to himself at Sinai. And he says, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, which that covenant is simply being obedient to all that the Lord has commanded them, then you will be my own possession of all the peoples. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be my kingdom, a priest, my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites. Moses does. And eventually in chapter 24, verse 3, he tells the people all the commands the Lord has given, which there are 3 chapters from, 20 through 23 that include a ton of commands that the Lord gives them and all his ordinances. Then all the people responded with a single voice, we will do everything that the Lord has commanded. Then he binds them to the covenant by shedding the blood of an animal, and he anoints both them and the book, and he signifies that you are bound to do this, as you have verbally, contractually agreed to. So the covenant is everything that the Lord has commanded, part of which is refraining from taking things that are devoted to haram, or destruction. Now, back to this concept of how it's violated and this use of the Hebrew word bru, or ber, the BR word. And back in Joshua 6, notice how it's rendered there. Joshua says to the troops, move forward, march around the city, and have the armed men go ahead of the ark of the Lord. And this is why reading certain things in the Hebrew context is so important, because if you appreciate the imagery of how this word is used in both contexts and the connection between them, first used here in Joshua 6 as part of a battle tactic. And Joshua is telling the people to advance against who? Who's in the city of Jericho? The enemies of the Lord and of the Israelites, the people who have been devoted to destruction. And thereby they are going to be the agents by which the Lord is going to exact that vengeance and his justice against these people as he has marked them for destruction. But when he says that they have violated my covenant using the same word, he is basically saying that they have moved against the Lord as if he is their enemy. And that as they have sought to destroy the Jerichoites, so now they are moving with that kind of tenacity against the Lord. Now, granted, it's not the entire corpus of the nation of Israel. It is only Achan, and of course the accomplices that may be involved with him. Certainly at this point, probably members of his family are becoming complicit with what it is that he has done, having knowledge of what he has taken and hidden, or if they do not at this moment, they will soon enough. So it's important for us to understand that, as the Lord is speaking about how they have violated the covenant. Moving along to verse 11 of Joshua 7, they have taken some of what was set apart. They have stolen, deceived, put those things with their own belongings. This is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies, and they will turn their backs, run from their enemies, because they themselves have been set apart for destruction. Notice that the huge, very dramatic turn of events and posturing of the people, because just a little while before this, Jericho as a city was set up for complete destruction, set apart for total annihilation, and everything that they would plunder from the city would be given over to the Lord to do as he sees fit with. But there would be nothing that they get as part of this. Again, everyone in the city, as goes people who have life, are devoted to destruction. And now the Lord is saying that they have become like Jericho, and they are set apart for destruction. Why? Because they have something of haram in their midst, and by virtue of that, they themselves have now become haram. Just like having one of the Lord's holy things that are a part of the sanctuary or tabernacle complex. And by virtue of that, they sin against the Lord's holy things, and then they have to restore what has been taken or what has been violated by not only giving it back, but adding a fifth to it, as goes the guilt offering that's set up in Leviticus. What that means is that just simply what is the Lord's, and it's not to be trifled with, nor taken lightly or used in a common and profane way. And if you do that, then you have brought upon yourself the guilt and the shame and reproach of what it is that you've done. And if it's not set right, then of course it can lead to far graver circumstances in the end, or consequences. And that is exactly what has happened here. Now notice there was something spoken to this, as we alluded to last week in Joshua 6, as he is preparing them for the march around the city. He says the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Keep yourselves apart, or from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. And here we have this very self-fulfilling prophecy being given to us in the next chapter. If you take any of those things, then you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. So it's not surprising then, given the very words and the ominous warning that Joshua gave them, that the entire community is going to be affected by the actions of just one man. For all the silver and gold, the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into his treasury. Moving on with Joshua 7. Then the Lord gives the prescriptive remedy for this. Go and consecrate the people. And we don't know exactly what it was that Joshua was supposed to do or tell them to do in consecrating themselves. Is it to be seen the same way that it was in earlier contexts with respect to consecrating, or every person consecrating themselves to prepare to meet the Lord? at Sinai, in which they were told to refrain from having sexual intercourse. We don't know, but whatever it was, no doubt, as these people are taking the opportunity to reflect upon what's happened here, as Joshua is not only going to convey these instructions, but he's also going to tell them, consecrate themselves for tomorrow. This is what will happen. The God of Israel says, there are things that are set apart among you, and you will not be able to stand against your enemies until you remove what is set apart. In the morning, all of you will present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord selects is to come forward, clan by clan. The clan the Lord selects is to move forward, family by family. And the family the Lord selects is to come man by man. And the one who is caught with things set apart must be burned, along with everything he has, because he has violated the Lord's covenant and committed an outrage in Israel. Now, while it is entirely possible that the rest of Achan's extended family may very well have been taken by surprise the next day when this very procedure takes place, and Achan is the one who is identified through the process by which the Lord makes it clear which tribe it is, which clan, which family, and which man. And once his family realizes that it's him, no doubt fear may very well begin to consume them as they realize they may be caught up in this as well. Now it says he has violated the Lord's command and he must be burned. It doesn't say that their family must be burned, but of course that is how this story ends up. But more likely what probably happened is that Achan's family was made aware by what Achan brought into the tent, which I would imagine it's somewhat difficult to hide such things in this kind of communal setting where you don't have a house with dedicated walls and partitions or secret places that you can hide things. It seems like he dug a hole in the ground and buried it there. And so if some of his family members saw him do this and they did not say anything, and then of course that evening when Joshua had conveyed the command of the Lord as goes what they are to do, however they are to consecrate themselves, and what will transpire the next day, that they perhaps had the chance to discuss this and attempt to try to make it right, but they don't. And the next day, once the entire assembly comes together, no one comes stepping forward and saying, we don't need to do this because we can tell you exactly what's happened. But because we can't definitively say exactly what happened there, what we can look at here is an interesting use of the word here that's rendered for us, at least in the CSB, as select and or caught. Two different English words that come from the exact same Hebrew word, which is what you see here on the screen that comes from this tiny little root right here, these three letters that you see right there. So, those three letters. And from that, we have either takes or he who is taken. So whoever the Lord takes or and the one who is taken, as would be seen here by the word caught. And the way this is often rendered in almost every other context it's used in Scripture would be seen the way that a person will come against another and take them, capture them as a prisoner of war, or more often than not, when one group moves against another city or group, and then they wind up capturing some prisoners from them. So the word means itself to capture or seize like you would a prisoner of war. So the Lord is going to take captive a tribe, a clan, a family, and then a man. And of course, allow all the others to go because they are innocent parties by virtue of the fact they know nothing, presumably, of what's going on here. And while an entire tribe and a clan and a family is going to be somewhat guilty for what has happened here, and shame has been brought on them, the entire tribe of Judah, by virtue of what Achan does, yet every bit of that guilt gets passed on to Achan once the people wind up stoning him. And one might wonder, well, why exactly is this punishment so harsh? And I think, one easy explanation can very well be, like you will see as part of a repeated pattern in other contexts. Adam in the garden, certainly Saul, the first king of Israel, who winds up having the kingdom stripped from him after two rather simple acts of disobedience in comparison to what David does. And then later on, even in the New Testament, with respect to Ananias and Sapphira, and how, because of the times and, of course, the status of the person involved, perhaps the Lord makes examples of these people. But we already have something of a prescriptive formula in Deuteronomy 13, where Moses goes on to say, if you hear it said about one of your cities, the Lord your God is giving you to live in, that wicked men have sprung up amongst you. I think we can all pretty easily agree that what Achan did was rather wicked. Having said that, the wicked men have sprung up among you, led the inhabitants of their city astray, and said, let's go worship other gods. Now, perhaps in some indirect way, maybe we can make something of a case for this being idolatry. I think the strongest argument for that would be, again, paralleling this against the Genesis 1-3 prologue, and the idea that if what Adam and Eve did in the garden was idolatry by virtue of elevating self above God in their sense of aggrandizing their own desire, to have the wisdom that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil would give them, and allow them to make decisions as goes what is right and wrong, and how they will rule this world that God has placed underneath them and their authority, without having to rely on God, that they will be like God themselves, as the Shining One had attempted to convince them of. And that is considered idolatrous. Then what Achan did, I think, in every way counts the same, because he was told not to take the things that belong to the Lord. And his desire, as he said clearly, he coveted those things, was more important to him than the command of the Lord, which I think in every way does perhaps count as idolatry. But it's not seen explicitly the way it is presented in Deuteronomy 13 by a person attempting to try to establish the name of another god or gods, and attempt to try to draw the people after them with their hearts, and worshiping them by offering sacrifices and so forth. Worship other gods which you have not known. You are to inquire, investigate, interrogate thoroughly. If the report turns out to be true, that this detestable act has been done among you, you must strike down the inhabitants of that city with the sword, completely destroy everyone in it as well as its livestock with the sword. You are to gather all of its spoil in the middle of the city square, completely burn the city and all its spoil for the Lord your God. So notice that. Notice the parallels between what is about to happen here with respect to Achan and his family. They are told to take everybody and put them to the sword, so that no one survives the catastrophe. No one in Achan's family lives through this. They are all stoned to death. Completely destroy everyone in it, as well as their livestock. Even his ox and his sheep and so forth are put to the sword. You are to gather all of the spoil in one place, the middle of the city. It's the valley of Achor that Achan and his things are all gathered together, family, possessions, and so forth. And then they are to completely burn the city. Obviously, everything that's gathered in the city square, everything is burned in the valley of Achor. And then, of course, they heap a huge pile of stones on it to make a memorial out of it from that point forward. So Moses had already given the remedy for what these people were supposed to do. And in a very real way, what Achan had done was remarkably similar to these circumstances that Moses is describing here in Deuteronomy 13, in leading the people astray by taking things that were devoted to Haram, the Lord, and the ban, right? So moving on with verse 21, he says, as he's confessing his sin, when I saw amongst the spoils a beautiful cloak from Babylon, or Shinar, the plain of Shinar, where Mesopotamia would be, and Babylon was for a time before it was destroyed, and then the new kingdom of Babylon in the days of Daniel was born. 5 pounds of silver, a bar of gold weighing 1.25 pounds, and I coveted them and took them. I don't think there is a stronger moment of parallel to the Genesis prologue than this particular moment here, because we see the exact same words being employed in the Genesis narrative. Not only in English, as Achan says, when I saw, and we have the woman saw. Notice in Hebrew, it comes from the exact same word, though it looks a little different structurally. Remember, Hebrew, being a consonantal language, has roots by which vowels are added to make subtle variations of words. And the vowelization and the verb tense of those words is what's going to determine that. Having said that, though, the same root letters appear with respect to each of these, and you can see that quite clearly here with this letter, these 2 letters here. So both cases, the same word. And then he says, among the spoils, a beautiful cloak And the woman saw that the fruit itself was the exact same thing. It's two different Hebrew words. I'm sorry, two different English words, but the exact same Hebrew word, as you can appreciate from the lexical reference in and of itself. T-O-B, T-O-W-B. So good, beautiful. Both the woman saw that the fruit was good, beautiful, as does Achan seeing that the cloak was good or beautiful, pleasing to the eye to take. He says, I coveted them and I took them. And by virtue of the fact he took them, the same thing with the woman here who took them, as you can see from the derivatives of the Hebrew words being used there. And so the reason why this confession is being structured the way that it is, if Achan said anything else, it's not included in this. And these words are arranged as they are for the sake of showing us the direct link, the textual connection between this story and the Genesis prologue to help us understand that trouble is brewing in the garden. And think about where this story happens in the proximity of the development of the narrative so far and what has just happened in recent chapters. Yeah, it was chapter 3 that they crossed over the Jordan, but chapter 5 that they celebrate the Passover after all these men who had been left uncircumcised were brought into right covenant relationship with the Lord by being circumcised, and now they are primed, fit, and ready to start the process, of course, after they hit the procedures, to go against Jericho. And that turns out quite swimmingly because the Lord instructs them and they follow his wisdom as is given to them. As silly as it may have sounded in the moment, as goes marching around the city and not actually attempting to try to just go and take the city, now that they have approached its gates and walls, they listen to the Lord. The Lord truly does hand over the city by bringing the walls down and make them easy, making the city's inhabitants easy spoil and prey for them. Same could have happened here with Ai, an even smaller city, but they do not invoke the Lord. Instead, Achan, doing what he does, brings sin upon within the camp, and of course, trouble within the new provincial Eden space. And God is not going to just simply cast them out. Rather, he is going to take Achan and he is going to cast him out, as he does Adam and Eve, sending them off into exile outside the garden, albeit the exile that Achan and his family is consigned to is that of death. And why? Because of the theocratic nature of Israel's relationship with the Lord that is different than the relationship in the covenantal status that Adam and Eve have. Though the covenant that Israel exists under in their relationship with the Lord is built upon the same construct as that of Adam and Eve. Hence the reason these stories are linked together, yet it's much more expansive, making room for the theocratic rule of the Lord. Now, granted, we have the establishment of God's kingdom rule in the Genesis prologue. And of course, we're talking about God's kingdom here, but this kingdom is different. It's different in the way that it is a kingdom of people amongst a sea of other kingdoms of people who have physical, living, breathing human rulers over them. And in this sense, the Lord is their ruler. He is their king. But every one of these nation city-states have laws that they live under. And of course, the king is the one who executes and exacts those laws over the people as he wields his authority over them. The same here is clearly seen with respect to the Lord. They are going to be a fully functional nation, like all the other nations around them, except at this particular moment in their time, they do not have a physical human ruler over them, a person who is guiding them in the way that Joshua and Moses has. They are not called king, nor are they revered as such, at least not in the way other nations would be revering their kings. Rather, that level of reverence is supposed to be given to the Lord, all right? Just to try to help us make better sense of that. But moving on with the story, then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the cloak, bar of gold, all of his possessions. They brought them to the valley of Achor. Valley of Achor, and that's the reason why Joshua says, why have you brought us trouble? Repeats the word when he says, today the Lord will bring you trouble, which is incredibly ironic to say to a man whose name in and of itself means trouble. You have been trouble amongst us, Achan. Yes, because my name is Achan. And now the Lord is going to bring Achan upon you. And by virtue of that, the place where you will be laid to rest is going to be called the Valley of Achor. Israel stoned him to death. They burned their bodies, threw stones on them, raised over him a large pile of rocks that remains there until today. Then the Lord turned his burning anger away from them. Therefore, that place is called the Valley of Achor, still today. So notice here how the Lord had burned, as goes his anger against Israel because of the actions of Achan. That anger and vengeance has been turned away. But notice in the very real way that this is exacted against Achan and his family by virtue of Israel being the judgmental force and thrust that God uses to exact his justice, as he has already begun to establish that precedent in using Israel coming against the nation states in the land of Canaan, against Jericho first, and he is going to continue that parade all the way through Ai, Bethel, and in various other cities and places. Yet here he is doing this against one of his own covenant people, that being Achan and his larger extended family. And this is seen in a very literal and real way by virtue of the fact that they did indeed burn Achan, his family, and all their possessions. And this action in and of itself by Yahushua, the one whose name means God is salvation, I think in a lot of ways parallels back again with the Genesis prologue and that glimmer of hope that is given to us after the act of rebellion of the first image bearers in the garden. The woman who saw that the fruit was delightful, good, beautiful, and took it as much as Achan had done. And yet the Lord promises to them, I will put hostility between you and the woman, speaking to the serpent, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, you will strike his heel. The Lord is saying he is the agent by which this will be brought to pass. And here we have this very thing. The tempter, the shining one, is trying to brew trouble in the garden through the actions of Achan. But yet the Lord has brought his man, Yahushua, God is salvation, his salvation to bear against this by squashing the head of this snake and putting this act of blasphemous rebellion to rest underneath the pile of rocks where the ashes of these people and their possessions lay, so that the battle campaign can continue. And as the story in the Garden of Eden context does not end, but God continues to commune with Adam outside the garden and then his sons after him. I should say along with him. He's not dead by that point in time. So God is continuing to work through the agency of his people. That leads us into the context of chapter 8, and I'm not going to belabor this too often much, but I will say that from what we gather from the impending conquest of the city of Ai, notice here how this almost parallels exactly what happened with the city of Jericho right before its demise, because the Lord said to Joshua then, I have handed over to you Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers. He tells him now, do not be afraid. Take all the troops with you. Go attack Ai. I have handed over to you the king, his people, city, and land. And treat Ai and its king as you did Jericho and its king, except in this case, everything is not haram. You can have what it is that you plunder. So this is to set the people back on the proper track. Now that the serpent's head temporarily has been squished underfoot and retributive justice has been exacted against those who acted as the woman did in the garden and seeking to advance their own story and their own agenda and seeking what was wise in their own eyes as opposed to the wisdom of the Lord, which is the path that he has set these people on. Hence the reason at many points he has said, if you are careful to obey, to walk with me, obviously in the wisdom and light of his commands, his guidance, his Torah to them, then you will have and possess and receive all of these things. Now the Lord is setting them back on track to receive and have and experience all of these things. Moving on with the narrative, after taking the city and setting it on fire, follow the Lord's command, see that you do as I have ordered you. So this is Joshua's preemptive orders given to them before the battle ensues. And then later on in 18 through 19, when the battle is underway, then the Lord said to Joshua, hold out the javelin in your hand toward Ai, for I will hand the city over to you. And so Joshua does just that, mimicking Moses, holding his javelin out toward the city, almost as Moses was holding up the staff in the air when they were fighting against the Amalekites with Joshua on one arm and Hur on the other arm. Or Moses at the Red Sea, holding up his staff over the waters as it was being parted throughout the evening and night hours, leading on into the early morning hours of the following day. And then with that, And Joshua held out his javelin toward the city, and when he held out his hand, the men quickly in ambush rose from their position. They ran, entered the city, captured it, and set it on fire. So they are streaming into it. As much as Moses was holding out his staff and the Red Sea was parting and the people of Israel began to walk through, now Joshua is holding out this javelin toward the city, and the people are running almost in this bottleneck fashion down the central road that leads, no doubt, into the main gate of what was the city complex of Ai, and flood into the city itself to then set it on fire and quickly put it under subduance in order to cause the people of Ai to lose heart, realizing that their city has been taken, and of course set those people to flight, which is exactly what happens. The pursuers become the pursued as Israel turns on them, having lied in wait or lay in wait to ambush them, as they have successfully done now. And so this to simply reflect that the Lord's wisdom is yet again being honored, which is exactly what was supposed to be happening all along. And had it been, then perhaps the conflict of Ai never would have happened. Conflict in the sense that they originally lost. Now, granted, that was not because of Joshua's problem. Let's say that Joshua had done exactly as he had done at Jericho, when these men had came back to him and said, I'm not really sure we need a sizable force here, maybe just a small contingent force that we can send out there. And Joshua may have decided, well, hold on, let's go and inquire of Eleazar, Aaron's son, the new high priest. Let him hear from the Lord using the Urim and the Thummim. And had that happened, perhaps the first little skirmish at Ai never would have actually ensued, perhaps because the Lord then would have taken the opportunity to reveal they should not take it. They should not go in the first place. Now, who knows, maybe if the Urim and the Thummim was used, that maybe that would have revealed that the Lord was saying, no, do not go with that plan. Hopefully that would have led Joshua to then inquire of the Lord, well, then what would you have us do? And however the Lord would have divulged that information, probably by speaking directly to him, as he has at many points in the story so far, would have made him aware of the fact there is trouble, and this needs to be rectified before any further battle can be strategized or taken underway. So that perhaps would have prevented what happened at Ai, but that is not how the story itself is written. But now, as this conflict has passed, that the Lord is being reverenced as he should be, and Joshua is seeking to follow the wisdom and counsel of the Lord, which is exactly what was supposed to happen in the Genesis 1-3 prologue. That is what the first image bearers in the garden were supposed to do, is trust the Lord, and then by virtue of that, eventually come around to eating from the tree of the knowledge or the tree of life, and then perhaps at some point, maybe being invited to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, had the Lord ever made that open and available, or realized the needlessness of it only because the Lord has made it amply clear to them what is right and wrong, and they continue to trust what he defines as right and wrong, and appreciate the authority that he has given them in allowing them the ability to co-rule with him in this paradisal space that he has crafted just for them, to start the project of blessing the world and filling it with his wisdom and ultimately his glory. Israel is supposed to be doing the same thing. They have stumbled as the original image bearers have done, but now they have been set on the right track, because the Lord is not going to simply just do them all in and then attempt to try to start anew because of the blasphemous actions of just one man. The other context that we've looked at, such as the golden calf or their refusal to enter the land, was something that had communal-wide consequences, or a communal-wide involvement that led to communal-wide consequences. And so, having said all that, what are we to take away from this, as goes our understanding of how this maybe connects in some way to the New Testament narrative, as you've seen me at certain points tie this into the way that Matthew lays out his gospel narrative with respect to the influences of Moses and Joshua in that story, and how he delineates Jesus's story with respect to his words, his teachings, his miracles, the way he assembles his followers and so forth. I think a lot of what we're looking at here is the idea that the commands that the Lord gives in the gospel narratives are unconventional. I mean, considering the idea that his disciples probably in every way were assuming that they were going to fight against Roman soldiers, that they were going to be going against those Roman sympathizers who are their own countrymen, who, when given the chance out of mercy and kinship, the chance to join Jesus as Messiah or suffer the consequences, which means basically consigning them to a place of basically being uncircumcised, like the uncircumcised Romans that they hope to be fighting in the future, the very near future, once Jesus as Messiah begins to establish his earthly kingdom by taking over the capital of Jerusalem and obviously the temple in its precincts. But that is not what Jesus has come to do. And when Jesus begins to make it very clear to them, that is not what his mission is. But Jesus has a mission, and that mission is going to end soon. And he has a mission for them that he trains them for while he's with them. And then after he leaves them, they are to go and continue this mission, not establish a new mission, but to continue this mission, which is complete abandonment of the mission they thought they were going to have all along. So all that to simply say, his commands are unconventional, but they have to trust him. And at times they don't. And when that happens, Jesus calls them out. He castigates them for it, but he renews them and he sets them back on the right path. I mean, at one point, he even winds up calling Peter Satan because of the fact that he attempts to try to obstruct Jesus's mission and agenda of going to the cross so that he can be enthroned, so that new creation and new humanity can be born through his salvific substitutionary atonement and sacrifice on the cross itself. So we might see the same thing. Now, of course, a lot of us have been conditioned to understand that things like loving your neighbor as yourself is right in every context. But of course, very often we spend little time actually exploring or mining out from Scripture what loving your neighbor looks like. We have a tendency to parallel that with something that we call hospitality, just generally being nice to people. While it's not hard to open up our home and to invite somebody in and cook a meal for them, yet it's difficult in some contexts to be able to love your neighbor when they've just been downright nasty to you. And of course, we could go on talking for hours about what this means beyond this. But the point I make is that the wisdom of the Lord in comparison to the wisdom of the world is very unconventional. And it requires deep meditative contemplation for us to understand how we are to go about doing this. And that has not changed for the people of God from the beginning of this story until now. And the people of God that are the followers of Jesus, we're on the same track. And by virtue of that, we are to be patterning ourselves after the example that Jesus gave, as scandalous and controversial as that was at times, and making sure that we are loving others as he has commanded and shown us how to love, being obedient to him in every way so that he doesn't look at us and say, why do you call me Lord when you don't do what I say? Or even worse, you might think I'm your Lord, but I never knew you. So let's reflect on these things as we continue to read through the story of Joshua in the coming weeks in Sunday school. I know we're already past this with the Bible reading plan. We just wrapped up Ruth, and we're going to be jumping into Samuel soon. But having said that, the point I simply make in this is as we go back and study these lessons and maybe even revisit some of these passages over the course of the week in preparation for Sunday school next week, we'll look back to these events and start to see them in a slightly different light. And of course, if we're dawdling in the New Testament somewhere, that we'll start to see its influence there as well. Thanks for listening. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we are grateful, as we always are, Lord, for the chance to hear from you, your word. I pray, Lord, that you will make these things abundantly clear to us as only you can. Renew us, change our hearts, help us to understand and see that you have explained to us and showed us how we are to love. And apart from you, that is impossible. We need your ever renewing presence within us to change the way that we see others around us and the things that we take for granted in our understanding as goes what it means to love others as you love us, or to love others as we love ourselves. Help us to understand that without you changing our perspective on things, it is absolutely impossible to love at that level, and that we need you in every way. We ask this in your name. Amen.